Good. All right. Hopefully you can now hear me and see my slides. First of all, thank you very much to Mitya for inviting me to participate in this symposium. It's a great pleasure to be here among such distinguished company. As Mitya says, I work in a school of education. I'm a philosopher of education. So my interest in this topic has to do with whether and what schools might be doing under the broad heading of counter-extremism. Should schools be involved in the exercise of countering extremism, and what might they reasonably be asked to do? So I'm going to start just by saying a little bit about the situation in the UK. I think it'll be familiar to many of you. By talking a little bit about the prevent duty. So schools in England are legally required to have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. Not just schools, but a whole raft of public institutions are supposed to take seriously this obligation to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. To fulfill this prevent duty, schools in particular are charged with, first, identifying and referring to the police children at risk of radicalisation, and second, providing learning opportunities that build pupils' resilience to radicalisation. We might call these charges the custodial part and the educational part of the prevent duty. They're both controversial in different ways. I'm not going to talk today about the custodial task, the part of the prevent duty that has to do with identifying and referring children to appropriate authorities. What I'm interested in is the educational part of the prevent duty, that is the attempt to build resilience in all children to radicalisation and extremism. Here are a couple of the government's definitions of those terms. Radicalisation and extremism are defined by the government as follows. Radicalisation is the process by which a person comes to support terrorism and forms of extremism leading to terrorism. I'm not going to take issue with that as a definition of radicalisation. I think it's okay. Extremism, on the other hand, is defined as vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. That seems to me fairly hopeless as a definition of extremism, so I'm not proposing that we take it further. Among the educational measures recommended for building resilience to radicalisation are providing a safe environment for debating controversial issues, equipping pupils to understand and manage difficult situations, helping them to recognise and manage risk, teaching them effective ways of resisting pressures, and cultivating positive character traits. All of which sound okay, but they're pretty vague. They're not giving us anything very concrete here that schools might do. So my worry about these is not really that there's much to object to in any of those, so much as that they're not really concrete. They don't give teachers a lot of guidance as to what exactly they're supposed to do in the name of building resistance to extremism. Okay, so there are clearly lots of problems with the prevent duty. There's much to worry about here. First, the custodial part of the duty casts teachers in the role of informants, undermining trust in teacher-pupil relationships and inhibiting open discussion in the classroom. That seems to me a genuine concern about this new duty that's been placed on schools. Second, as I've suggested, the government's definition of extremism is strikingly inadequate. And thirdly, the recommended resilience building measures are excessively vague and diffuse. So I don't want to underestimate the significant problems that there are with the prevent duty and the current educational policy. However, nor do I want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The idea that schools have a role to play in helping children resist the lure of extremism is not obviously mistaken. Armed with a more adequate analysis of extremism and a more focused set of educational measures, it is plausible to think that teachers might indeed serve as agents of counter-radicalisation. So my aim here is to defend the educational project of countering radicalisation by identifying a core component of the extremist mindset and sketching an account of what teachers can and should do to discourage its formation in pupils. Now, obviously, as defences go, that's only a tiny fraction of the work that needs to be done. As I will try to show, extremism is a capacious and complex, multifaceted concept. There are many traits and aspects to what constitutes an extremist and what constitutes an extremist mindset. And all I'm going to do is identify one of those traits and show that it's a bad trait and there is something that educators can do to counter it. But a more comprehensive account is going to have to look at many other traits of extremism and ask questions about whether these are genuinely in and of themselves undesirable traits, and if they are, whether it's appropriate and possible for schools to do something about them. So I'm just nibbling at the edge of this big task by focusing in on one particular trait of extremism. Okay, so I have had the great privilege and good fortune of being allowed to have a sneak preview of Quassim Cassam's forthcoming book on extremism, the one he talked about in his presentation this morning. I'm glad he's here because I'm slightly worried that what I'm about to say is a misrepresentation. So I'm going to hope that he will correct me if that's the case in the discussion after this talk. However, following Quassim Cassam, I take extremism to be a family resemblance concept whose characteristic features include beliefs with certain kinds of ideological content, a readiness to resort or incite others to resort to violence, some familiar epistemic vices, and a range of associated preoccupations, emotions, attitudes, and thinking styles. The reasons I'm not entirely clear that Quassim would accept this is because I'm not sure whether he wants to say there's one fuzzy family resemblance concept of extremism with all these components, or if he actually wants to hold the line that there are actually three quite distinct concepts of extremism, in which case this would be a misrepresentation of his position and I'm not quite following him. Nevertheless, the way I want to interpret him is as suggesting that all of these elements feature in our standard concept of extremism, and whether we count any particular individual or movement as an extremist movement will depend on it meeting a sufficient number of these criteria. While Cassam recognizes that extremists are distinguished in part by the ideologies to which they subscribe, and in part by the methods to which they resort, it is the psychology of extremism that particularly interests him. Salient features of the extremist mindset include preoccupations with purity, virtue, and victimhood, the emotions of anger, humiliation, resentment, and self-pity, the attitudes of refusal to compromise, indifference to harm, intolerance and anti-pluralism, and thinking styles that are conspiracist, apocalyptic, and catastrophic. I'm very sympathetic to this general account of extremism and of the extremist mindset, and I'm heavily indebted to it. So I'm not proposing to take issue with or challenge or try to correct the account of the concept that Quassim's given us. Rather, what I want to do is say, okay, if we work with an account of extremism, something along these lines, then what might be an appropriate educational response if we're concerned with counter-radicalization? All right, so as we've seen, one of the attitudes Quassim regards as integral to the concept of extremism is refusal to compromise or unwillingness to compromise. So the feature of the extremist mindset I want to focus on here is refusal to compromise. So here's Cassam. One thing that extremists are in favor of is being totally uncompromising, at least in some domains. Extremists are so preoccupied with purity that for them, not even keeping the peace justifies sanguine compromises. They would literally rather die or go to war than compromise. And he cites Margolid. He also mentioned Margolid in his presentation this morning. And Margolid holds that sectarianism, which we might for our purposes take to be synonymous with extremism, is a disposition to view any compromise as a rotten compromise. So it seems phenomenologically plausible to suppose that many of the people we are inclined and the movements that we're inclined to classify as extremists do indeed exhibit this trait of refusal or unwillingness to compromise. Cassam construes refusal to compromise as an attitude in the psychological sense. He writes, one's attitude towards something is one's evaluative posture towards it. For example, to say that extremists deplore compromise is to make a point about their attitude or posture towards compromise. They are against it. In contrast, the belief that it is raining is not an attitude towards rain. Changing a person's beliefs about something does not necessarily change their attitude towards it. The reason he's at pains to distinguish this psychological sense of attitude is that there's a philosophical sense of attitude in which beliefs are epistemic attitudes or attitudes towards propositions. And so he's wanting to distinguish attitude in the psychological sense that concerns him here from those philosophical attitudes or from beliefs. And I want to follow him in that. And I think it's important to be clear about this because it follows that an attitude in the psychological sense is fundamentally non-cognitive. It might be propped up or underpinned by certain cognitive states. There might be certain beliefs that lead to or keep in place a non-cognitive attitude of hostility towards compromise, but it's not itself a belief. And so that's going to have implications for how we might educate against it. So attitudes then are non-cognitive. They are not themselves beliefs, though they may be underpinned and sustained by beliefs. All right, so countering refusal to compromise. What then might schools do to counter the attitude of refusal to compromise, to steer pupils away from this evaluative posture? My proposal is that schools should actively promote the contrary evaluative stance. They should try to bring it about that pupils are not against compromise, but for it. That is to say, schools should cultivate in pupils the attitude of readiness to compromise. So that's a fairly intuitive and straightforward thought. If we don't want children to be compromise refusers, we want them to have the attitude of being ready to compromise. Sorry, momentarily lost my place. All right, so what's involved in educating attitudes? I take attitude promotion to have two basic components: a cognitive or discursive component, whereby pupils are brought to understand the good reasons for having the target attitude. And secondly, a non-cognitive or formative component, whereby pupils are given experiences designed to induce the target attitude itself. It matters that there are this distinction because it isn't necessarily the case that simply because one understands the good reasons there are for having a certain attitude, it doesn't follow that one will have that attitude, right? There are plenty of instances where we wish we were other than we were. We wish our dispositions or inclinations were different because we understand the reasons why we'd be better off if they were different, but nevertheless, they don't just change. Simply recognizing the problem with an attitude or trait or disposition isn't in itself enough to change it, or indeed recognizing the merits of one isn't itself enough to induce it, or may not be. It's a complicated psychological story to be told here. But nevertheless, I think if we're serious about promoting readiness to compromise, we need both to present the justification for that attitude and to take steps to actually induce the attitude itself. So let's begin with the discursive component. Pupils should be encouraged to discuss and reflect on the attitude of readiness to compromise, to subject it to critical scrutiny with a view to helping them see that it is robustly justified. Of course, the attitude must actually be robustly justified for this method to work. There can be no question of deceiving or indoctrinating pupils. Only if there really are good reasons for being ready to compromise can pupils be brought to understand those reasons by means of discussion and reflection. So I want to head off any suggestion that I am in the business of advocating the sort of imposition of beliefs on young people in the absence of good reasons. This is not about instilling beliefs regardless of the evidence. It's about encouraging them to form those beliefs for which we have very good reason. And so it's only going to be possible to have a rational education that promotes discursively the attitude of ready to compromise if that attitude is indeed a robustly justified attitude, one that we all have good reason to hold. Fortunately, however, readiness to compromise is not hard to justify. Graham Hayden's a philosopher of education who worked at the UCL Institute of Education for many years, and I'm referring here to his very good book, Values in Education, which I highly recommend to you. Graham Hayden suggests that we might begin by encouraging reflection on cases of intrapersonal compromise. That is, on the compromises each of us routinely makes among our own values. He writes, compromising over values should not cause us any special qualms, because there is a sense in which as individuals, we all very frequently and quite properly compromise between different values. So personally, I value both staying on top of my work and taking weekends off to spend time with the family, but I can't realize both, so I compromise. So on very, very many weekends, although I would love to take the whole weekend off, I simply can't do that. And although I probably ought to work the whole weekend, I prefer not to do that. So I strike a compromise. I do some work on Saturday morning, and then I try and take the rest of the weekend off to spend with the kids. I strike a compromise between two things I want, between two goods. And we all do this all the time. It only takes a moment's reflection on our lives and how we make judgments and how we make decisions on a daily basis to realize that we are constantly compromising and trading off among our own goals and value sets. And according to Hayden, cases of interpersonal compromise are not fundamentally different. It seems that what is happening here is in principle just the same as what happens when one person, having to come to some resolution of a moral problem, weighs up a number of values which come into play and arrives at some compromise between them. In the case of the group, the compromise is between values that happen to be held by different persons. Where agreement must be reached on a collective policy or course of action among people with different values, goals, or preferences, the solution is usually to compromise. So Hayden proposes that we can take young people through this series of ordinary, familiar, everyday examples, first thinking about how they strike compromises intrapersonally among their own values, and then interpersonally, where different people want different outcomes of a situation, and so we have to strike a bargain with them or make a compromise with them to agree on a course of action we can all live with. So crucially, compromises do not involve giving up the values or goals in relation to which concessions are made. To accept a collective policy or course of action that is suboptimal with respect to some end is not to abandon that end. So to favour compromise is not to be willing to give up your values or your goals or your ends. It's simply to be willing to accept a course of action that's slightly less conducive to those goals or values or ends in the name of being able to pursue something collectively with others. And nor, of course, does readiness to compromise imply insistence on compromise. Sometimes compromise is inappropriate. For example, when the goals pursued by those on one side of a dispute are morally indefensible. So these are the kinds of compromises that Margaret wants to call rotten compromises. So if one person wishes to pursue a course of action that promotes inclusivity and fairness, and another one wishes to pursue a course of action that's overtly racist, well then these two people shouldn't compromise, because the goal pursued by one party is an indefensible, a morally repugnant goal, and therefore this is not the sort of situation in which compromise is appropriate. But a readiness to compromise doesn't imply any of that. It simply means that where compromise is appropriate, we should try to make one. So careful thought about the nature of compromise and the plurality of values, goals, and preferences in human life reliably vindicates the attitude of readiness to compromise. So I think schools should get kids in the mix thinking about these questions and helping them to see, to understand why compromise is such an important part of our both personal and interpersonal lives. Okay, and then finally, the other components forming readiness to compromise. What about the formative component of attitude promotion? It's one thing to understand what justifies the attitude of readiness to compromise, another to actually have that attitude, to be positively disposed towards compromising. Here I suggest the main task for educators is to give pupils first-hand experience of authentic and successful compromises. We should both devise situations and exploit naturally occurring situations in which pupils must agree on a collective course of action by means of compromise. That is to say, we can create little classroom exercises. We might think about exercises in citizenship education, where one child represents the arts community and another the military and another the health service, and they have to sort of make their case for a limited pot of resources in a sort of mini replica of the government's. And they have to strike compromises. They have to agree, okay, we'll give up this demands, but hold tight to this one in the name of coming to an agreement we can all live with. And by naturally occurring circumstances, I just mean kids falling out in the playground because one group of children wants to play football and the other group of children wants to play tag. Sorry, someone else in the same group wants to play tag. And so you says, well, why don't you play football in the morning break and tag in the afternoon break, and you come to a compromise. So we give children frequent, we deliberately give them frequent experiences of compromise successfully working in practice. By giving pupils positive experiences of compromise, showing them how making concessions facilitates agreements on mutually acceptable courses of action, we can induce in them the attitude of readiness to compromise. And I think this kind of attitude formation escapes the charge of being manipulative or miseducational because, and to the extent that, it's underpinned and accompanied by the provision of good reasons for having the attitude in question. So what justifies us in this kind of attitude induction is the fact that alongside it, we're also helping them to understand conceptually, ethically, why this is a good attitude to have. All right, there's a very quick summary, but I won't go through it because it simply recaps the points I've made, and I would prefer to take the time remaining for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your presentation. Obviously, Professor Cassam, thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks, Michael. That was terrific. I really love that. And I think the whole idea of educating for compromise, I think, is just tremendously interesting on a kind of practical level. So I just wanted to ask you about the following kind of scenario, right? Supposing you run one of your classes and you're trying to do the things that you described. So one of the things that will undoubtedly arise if you have a sufficiently talented group of students will be this distinction between appropriate and inappropriate compromises. Right. So supposing some student says to you, well, okay, I mean, of course, I agree that some compromises are appropriate and some are inappropriate. But the compromises that you are saying are appropriate compromises are precisely compromises that I'm telling you are not appropriate compromises. And the reason I think they're not appropriate is that to compromise on those things is just incompatible with my sense of, who I am, what I stand for. Right? So they might then say, well, so in other words, you're dressing up your ideological preferences in the guise of, these are appropriate versus inappropriate compromises. Now, of course, you'd have to be an incredibly talented student just to come up with all that. But I'm just wondering how you would deal with that. I mean, how would you deal with a student who says, I'm not going to compromise on these things, not because I'm against compromise, but because I'm against inappropriate compromises, and these are inappropriate.
Absolutely. So look, I think one thing to say here is there's lots and lots of reasonable disagreement about what we should and shouldn't compromise on. So to the extent that the student's making good points, well then fantastic, they've made a good point. And the students and she and I might reasonably disagree on whether this is the sort of thing upon which compromises should be made. Personally, I think that's all very healthy and not something we should worry about. I think if we encountered a student who genuinely held that any kind of compromise was a bad compromise, then a mistake has been made, and there are things we can do to show them that they're mistaken. Insofar as I'm concerned here, specifically with the cultivation of this attitude of readiness to compromise, then all that matters is that there are enough very plausible cases where compromise is the sensible thing to do, and we can give children enough positive experiences of compromising in those situations that they don't have an inbuilt resistance to the idea or the practice of compromising. I'm absolutely of the view that where we've got reasoned, rational disagreement between students and teachers on the particular issues of when we should and shouldn't compromise, that's great. That suggests to me the students thinking, and we should encourage it and not necessarily try to persuade them. They may well come to change their mind later, but that seems to me healthy.
Can I just ask, I'm really interested in this idea of yours. Have these sort of learning to compromise, educating to compromise classes, have they been tried? Is there any evidence of whether they succeed or not? Have you actually given a class like this? I
knew someone would ask me a difficult empirical question. So, I mean, I am an ex-school teacher. I did teach in primary schools in a former life, and but I'd never specifically led a discussion on this topic. So while I feel as though I have a good enough understanding of how classrooms work to feel entirely confident that the things I'm proposing here make good educational sense, no, I cannot point to a body of empirical evidence or indeed anecdotal evidence of this actually working. Doesn't mean it's not out there, but I don't know about it.
Thanks.